Thank you, Alexa. And I also would like to welcome everybody this morning. We have 4 distinguished speakers that soon will take the floor and convey and mediate their science. And after that, we have set aside a long time for discussion. So during the talks, please note your questions, and we'll be handing out time so that you can ask questions in the moderated session afterwards. So we have 4 speakers, and our first speaker is Dr. Tracey Galloway. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Tracey is a community health scholar whose research addresses the health priorities of circumpolar Indigenous people, involving reduction of the impact of chronic disease to applied health policy research. Galloway has a long track record of respectful engagement and successful collaboration with northern communities and organizations. Her current research projects include evaluation of the impact of the Nutrition North Canada Food Subsidy Program on food security, on quality assessments of Inuit people healthcare experiences, and analysis of the role of transportation infrastructure as a mediator of health service access for Indigenous people living in the remote northern communities. Tracey is also an expert consultant to the National Inuit Food Security Working Group and the Nunavut Food Security Coalition. She regularly participates as a reviewer and scientific officer for Canada's Tri-Council founding agencies, and is an active member of the Canadian Society for Circumpolar Health and also an editor of the International Journal of Circumpolar Health. We're very proud to invite you up on stage, Tracey, and she will be talking on Indigenous-led interdisciplinary research advances, understanding of climate-related impacts on food security and well-being in the Arctic communities.
Thank you, Dr. Craven and Alexei, and I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first time attending the Arctic Frontiers Conference, so I hope to meet many of you and develop some new collaborations from this work. And what I'd like to speak about this morning is not so much my research, although I'll bring some examples from that research, but talk about a style or a model of research that's that we're using in Canada to address the concern of food insecurity in Arctic populations. And the motivator for this style of research is, of course, something that motivates many of you in your work, and that's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And all of the countries that we represent are signatories to that declaration. And just to place you in the context of the Canadian Arctic, which is a little bit different than other regions, we have 118 communities in the Canadian Arctic that must be served by a very limited number of regional governments and structures. And it's almost an impossible challenge. And food insecurity rates in these communities are very, very high. So the Canadian Community Health Survey, which is our national ongoing assessment survey, it's like the NHANES in the States, estimates that food insecurity rates in the Northern Territories range anywhere from 17% to 51%. But that estimate is likely quite low because that sampling frame only involves the largest communities in the north, and we know that food insecurity is higher in smaller communities. And as you go north in Canada, the communities have higher and higher proportions of Indigenous people in their population. So the range is anywhere from about 15% in Yukon territories to as high as 95% in the smallest communities of Nunavut. So we're not serving these communities very well in terms of the structures and supports for food security. And so the approach we're taking in Canada, and I'm speaking very broadly here, I can't represent all the work, but I'm aware of quite a bit of it in my various roles. And the approach we're taking is one that reflects the UN Declaration principles, and that is a collaborative effort that is Indigenous-led and controlled, that really emphasizes using Indigenous forms of knowledge to solve the challenge of food insecurity, that is interdisciplinary, and that is highly policy relevant or applied. So I'm going to describe some examples of current food security research that's ongoing in Canada that reflect these principles. So in terms of Indigenous leadership and control, that begins at the very outset of research by recognizing within our funding bodies that the projects that address food insecurity need to be led by Indigenous people, and that means having Indigenous people as PIs and co-PIs. And the way that's enacted in Canada, and we're following models that are laid out by many of you in your scholarship, is to place the funding in the hands of the Indigenous communities. So more and more national funders are recognizing the need for this, that the power over the purse or the money is what controls what gets acted out in terms of research. So Indigenous community members are participating in peer review. They're participating in the design of funding programs with the national funders. And even, and I can tell you what this experience is like as a scientist, but often the funds are actually just directly given to an Indigenous organization like the National Inuit Organization, ITK, and then they put out their own funding call and solicit expertise, and we put in an application and wait to be selected by them. So it's a new experience for us, and it's a little uncomfortable at times as a scientist, but it really does place the control over what happens in the research in the hands of community members and their leadership. And we like to use this word control to replace the old form of consultation. So more and more we're not forming advisory committees of Inuit and other Indigenous organizations and checking in with them now and then. They actually form the core of the research team, and that's the model we're moving toward. We're also making sure that the Indigenous communities design the theoretical frameworks for the research, and that we select methods that are appropriate to the cultural space in which we're working. And our forms of dissemination place community dissemination at the core, right? So some examples of this are that the National Inuit Health Survey, which replaces that large Canadian representative study, the Canadian Community Health Survey that's ongoing, that, for which the sample is not very representative of Inuit. Now we have a federally funded National Inuit Health Survey, and it is run by the National Inuit Organization. And if that survey wants expertise from the various universities and health researchers across Canada, they will solicit a funding call within that health survey for that. Okay. Another good example is our national health funder, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, recently funded 2 teams under a funding call called Food Security and Climate Change in the Canadian North. And I'll give you some specifics about one of the teams that was funded. And then another is the National Inuit Organization's Nuluak Mapping Project, which maps food security projects across Canada. So this is an example of one of the food security and climate change projects that was recently funded. It's co-led by a number of Inuit scientists based in the North, and Shirley Harper, who sits on the IPCC. She's actually the lead author for the 6th assessment report. And this project is framed conceptually in a way that's consonant with Inuit traditional values. And you can see that it uses a storytelling or narrative approach to gathering information, which again reflects an Inuit approach to knowledge creation and sharing. And then I mentioned this Nuluak Mapping Project. This is a wonderful resource, and I maybe have made the link to it too small for you to see, so please ask me after and I'll provide a larger version for you. But it keeps an eye on food security initiatives in communities across the Canadian Arctic and provides resources for scientists, but mainly for other communities that want to attempt something similar, and contact information for folks in those communities so that they can speak to each other and expand the range of food security services that are offered. Okay. So the second important form of our approach is an emphasis on Indigenous knowledge. And I have to say, I'll say at the end, but I'll say right now, we are achieving this to greater and lesser degrees in projects across Canada, but this is the goal. So we want to use an indigenizing approach where possible, and that means that Indigenous scholars take the lead and their voices are privileged. Okay? And for those of us who have a settler background, and we're really working from the perspective of allies or supporters of this indigenization, we're taking a decolonizing approach. So one of the biggest contributions we can make is to identify the historical, social, political patterns that have led to the current situation. So I would place myself within the group of researchers working from this settler decolonizing perspective. And then you may have heard of this, and there are comparable methodologies across Northern Europe. But what is used in widespread fashion across Canada now is this two-eyed seeing approach, which was first articulated by a very valued Mi'kmaq elder from Eastern Canada named Albert Marshall. And this approach allows Western scientific and Indigenous scientific models to work side by side. There are other articulations of this in Canada. One is called Turo Wampum, which refers to a Southern Canadian beaded belt that existed in times when treaties were signed. And Turo Wampum, again, describes two canoes paddling down the same stream, and those can be viewed as two forms of science that interact and support each other at times and don't impede each other's flow down that river, but try and build understandings together. Okay. So some examples of the use of two-eyed seeing. There are many examples in the health literature, but I'd just like to point out a couple. The lowest one here in terms of a publication is a food security specific approach that embeds this two-eyed seeing within its framework. And this is used beyond the social sciences and health sciences, but now in studies of biological diversity and wildlife management. So it's a very effective form of collaborating with our Indigenous partners. A key component of this is interdisciplinarity, and that's of course because the challenges in circumpolar regions are so multi-layered and complex. So it's wonderful when teams incorporate applied science, engineering, health science, social science, and Indigenous science perspectives, because together they can actually build something that's of relevance to communities. Okay. And just to give a couple examples of this interdisciplinarity from my own research, so I'm just again pointing out the high food insecurity rates in the Arctic. We have a program in Canada that is a government-sponsored food subsidy that's designed to address this problem of high cost of food in the stores in Arctic communities. So that subsidy supports 118 communities that lack year-round surface access by road or sea. So these communities rely on air transportation for the majority of their perishable foods. And I've been doing some work over the past few years evaluating the efficacy of that subsidy. And I'll tell you in my summary of that is it's not very effective, and prices are very high across the north, and they are variable across communities and across time. So it's very difficult for people to predict what their costs will be from week to week. And that's, of course, very stressful for people, and we find that it's very much connected with morbidity and mortality in the Arctic. So one of the ways we're trying to examine this in an innovative fashion is we're trying to understand what are the mediators of food insecurity and high cost for people living in Arctic communities. And one of them is airport service or air service. So we did a little exploratory study just looking at some basic infrastructure across the north. And of course, any of you who've traveled in the Canadian Arctic know that airport infrastructure is very, very basic. So on the left, there's a picture of the runway at Grise Fjord, and it's 1,675 feet long. The minimum standard for an operating runway in Canada is 3,000 feet. So I think that's just over 500 meters. So it's very difficult to take off and land there, and it really limits the size of aircraft and the amount of cargo that can be flown, and that in turn affects the reliability of flying there. And of course, it never looks like that. It's usually, a snow runway. And then on the right, you see in contrast a community like Cambridge Bay that has a long history of military development. So it was part of the distant early warning line and has had American and Canadian air bases there for decades. And so it has a very, very long runway. And that means it's a much larger town. It's a government service town. It has a far lower amount of Indigenous people proportion living there, and food costs are lower there. Right? So one of the ways we're expanding on this research in a very interdisciplinary fashion is we're trying to look at what infrastructure upgrades would give us the best bang for our buck. So beyond just lengthening runways, how can we improve surface and lighting and safety equipment and runway and safety zones and de-icing? And so what are the infrastructure upgrades and how should we prioritize those to facilitate well-being, including food security for communities? So that's a very interdisciplinary project involving physics, environmental science, engineering. It's actually funded by the Center for Global Engineering at the University of Toronto. And then we're actually building on that to examine whether some technologies like artificial intelligence, operations research tools, and machine learning can help improve the operating systems of transportation networks that serve these communities. So here we're expanding beyond just air service to consider marine service, winter ice road development, and what are some feasible approaches that can better serve these communities. And finally, it is really important for us that all research we do around food security in Canada is applied and policy relevant. So in order to make it realistic and useful to communities, the communities and their representative organizations and governments need to be on board from the start so that the problems are defined by them, and then the approaches that we take just build on those expectations. Okay? And so this starts right at the beginning but goes all the way through the research until the evaluation phase and dissemination and then the building of new research questions around this. And we find this a really effective way of going about the work. And I'm sure this just models the types of approaches many of you use. So you can see that to make our airport infrastructure research policy relevant, what we're doing is we're trying to operationalize the concept of well-being in community terms. And this is more challenging than I expected. So I initially thought that it would just be food cost and health service access. But we find that transportation is a mediator for all sorts of aspects of well-being. So educational opportunities for children, the needs of specialized children in terms of health and social service needs. Planes fly the courts. So all legal aspects of legal services in the north are affected, the mail. So working in the area of transportation has made us expand our definition of what constitutes community well-being. And also, I thought transportation would be air, sea, and ice road sort of defined in those terms. But people, of course, have their own transportation routes by sea and by land, but don't show up on maps that are designed by governments, by which they visit brother and sister communities, by which they move country food around and exchange traditional food and live out networks that existed prior to the construction of any roads or airports. And so we need to take those into account. Okay. And similarly, for our AI and machine learning informed approaches, we're trying to build use cases that are defined by community members and their representative organizations and their service providers, not just by commercial operators in the north. And this really means that some of those technologies will have use value to the communities and not just replicate the inequities that we see already. So this is sort of the range of partners that we're approaching, the representative organizations or land claim organizations that you see listed there and the governments that serve them. And this aligns very nicely with some of the larger scale approaches happening at the National Research Council in Canada around AI for logistics modeling and the National Trade Corridors Initiative. So again, I just want to end by saying that progress toward this as a model for food security research is, we're further ahead in some cases and a little behind in other cases. So we recognize that it's a challenging process. But if any of you have similar experiences with trying to serve the Indigenous communities in your region in this decolonizing fashion, I'd love to hear about them, because I think we're all moving in this direction, and it's very challenging, and it's also uncomfortable for scientists many times. So it's good for us to talk about the progress that we're making. Okay, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Tracey.